Welcome to Third Perk Coffee House. We're here with WRCX TV 40. My name is Fred Cox, and I am here to moderate a very important conversation today. Passing the Torch, a critical analysis of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and its influence on leadership today. I'm so excited because I have two guests who are Martin Luther King Jr. scholars, and they're going to help me facilitate this conversation today. To my left, I have Chad White, Dr. Chad White, who is the pastor of Word Church here in Dayton, Ohio. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And to my right, writer, organizer, and activist, Grandy. Thank you so much for being here today.
Appreciate you.
So I want to have a conversation, but it's important to contextualize it. And I want to start with you because I think this conversation is going to be an intergenerational conversation in which we're going to be able to learn about the way in which his legacy has impacted you. And then just a generation later, we'll see how it has impacted Jared. So tell me, what is one of your very first memories of learning about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?
I am a fourth generation preacher, and so the Black church has been my total life from my earliest moment. And so I learned about Dr. King while attending church. That was my first time in Black history plays and learning about his speeches. So that was my first introduction to Dr. King.
And tell me a little bit about like what you learned. So you got introduced to church, but like what did you learn about this man?
I learned that Dr. King loved everybody. I learned that he gave his life for everyone, that he was hated by racists, and that he just literally wanted people to love each other and to get along.
I appreciate that. Jared Grandy, I want to ask you the same question just to see what your context was. Do you think about one of your very early moments when you learned about Martin Luther King? Do you remember where you were? What did you learn?
Yeah, the earliest moments, it was definitely in school. A Dayton public school, it's called Lowe's. I was second or third grade. And my very first introduction, like most people's introduction, is the 1963 March on Washington speech, I Have a Dream speech, and particularly the later half of that speech. No one really talked about the first half, and I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Okay.
But the part about everyone loving each other, not worrying about the color of one's skin, just the content of their character, just a very peaceful figure who just wanted everybody to love each other and get along.
Yeah, no, so I appreciate you sharing that, and I can imagine that we all had a very similar understanding or a similar experience with learning about the principles of Martin Luther King. I think about what I learned about him as a child, and I think about who I know him as today. So tell me a little bit, Dr. Chad White, what has Martin Luther King's legacy done for you personally, now that you're an adult?
Okay.
Tell me.
Awesome. For me, it has transformed my life, it's transformed my thinking, my perspective about beloved community, and the possibility of building this idea of the world house, that love as the motivating factor of what King used, agape, this God kind of love, that if we authentically work to build community, it can happen. Now, of course, we have to work through all the issues and all the ins and outs, but that the possibility of overcoming evil through nonviolent resistance and authentic Christian love, we can build the world house.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit more about that beloved community that you just mentioned, because I'm imagining that that's one of the principles or theories that came out of Martin Luther King that stand with you. Please tell me.
Absolutely. The beloved community would be that place where, again, that people can come together and live in authentic community, that going back to that March on Washington speech, that it's not about the color of your skin, but the content of your character, where all people can move together, they can build together, they can rise together in a place where ethics and morality and sincere brotherhood and sisterhood operate and reside.
Absolutely, and I appreciated understanding that about Martin Luther King, because when he introduced the beloved community, he introduced these facets. It was kind of a response of like, well, if you had to create a community, what would that community look like?
Sure.
And it is so, very much so referenced when individuals have to create what that looks like locally. And so it makes me think, Jared, what is one of those like defining moments for Martin Luther King's legacy for you personally? So I know you mentioned the March on Washington earlier, but tell me about a moment that is a very defining moment for Martin Luther King for you personally.
It's closer to the later end of towards the death, towards his assassination. When he was in Memphis, he was there to organize and advocate for the sanitary workers. Yeah. And that's where we get the "I am a man" phrase from. For me, it's important to understand that he was deeply involved in economic insecurity. He was deeply involved in economic inequities, right? He wasn't just worried about, yes, he was a great example of to teach us how to love somebody regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of the wrongdoings they might do upon you. He offered a lot of grace, but he was no fool. He understood the economic inequality that people face. He understood the job market and the structural issues that lie within it. And so for me, that he made a speech, it was called The Other America in 1968. And a careful reading of that speech has taught me how to analyze the issues as they exist today, as opposed to it's not enough to love people, right? Love is a verb. How do you love somebody? What analysis do you need to engage in to make sure our policy reflects the love of humanity? Dr. King was a master.
I really appreciate what you just said, because I think you created a timeline, and I don't even know if you were intentional, but you started off talking about the march kind of created, the march and the "I Have a Dream" speech kind of created a more lofty ideal or a theory as it pertains to like what we are looking for. But then as you transition to one of the speeches in his later point in life, The Other America, he begins to talk really specifically about how the nuances of these ideas and how there's some challenges. And we'll definitely make sure to return back to that conversation. Thank you so much for that. And so, Dr. White, tell me, what are the lessons? What is one lesson when you think about Martin Luther King's legacy that you think we really should be processing today? What is one of those lessons in a more specific sense than some of the broader contexts that we have spoken about?
I would say that commitment, steadfastness, stick-to-itiveness. Dr. King had a vision of what he thought America and the world could be, and he stuck to it. Again, when we get to the later part of his life with the more radical King, his last public speech was at Riverside Church in New York, behind Vietnam, and there were those in King's camp. There were those who were his financiers who said, "Doc, don't come out against the Vietnam War. It is suicide." Even Black America turned on King at that time. When King gets assassinated, his approval rating in Black America is below 50%. But he believed in justice, he believed in equity, and he recognized that the war in Vietnam, not only was it unjust because it was killing brown people that had never done anything to Black people, but secondly, it was taking away money and making the war on poverty. He says it wasn't even a good skirmish. And so money that had been allocated to war should have been allocated to alleviating poverty in America. And so I think it's stick-to-itiveness that over and over again throughout his life, when he went to Birmingham, there were those who told him not to do it. When he went to Memphis, his inner camp, they were planning for the Poor People's Campaign. They said, "Doc, don't go. What are you doing?" And he says, "I cannot ignore these people in Memphis." And so he goes to Memphis with the intention of getting back on the road to plan for the Poor People's Campaign. He gets assassinated. But anyway, I would say stick-to-itiveness. That would be what I take away from Dr. King.
I appreciate that. And I think what comes to my mind hearing both of you all respond is that you both bring up this kind of economic pressure that Martin Luther King posed as a strategy, right? And so kind of moving this message or this conversation away from just simply advocating on the basis of race issues, but also able to understand the intersectionality of how economically this world worked in a way to oppress and or suppress marginalized populations. So your reference is to Vietnam and individuals there, and then your reference are to the sanitary workers in Memphis. So let's talk just a little bit more about that strategy to articulate economically how it supports suppression or oppression. And so, Dr. White, I'd like you to speak to that first.
Okay.
The strategy of the economy, or the strategy of framing your civil rights activism in an economic framework.
Okay, I think Dr. King was clear that and I hope I don't get in trouble for this, but Dr. King was an economic Marxist, I believe, in wholeheartedly. Matter of fact, one of his mentors, while he was in school at Boston, said, it was his dad's friend, said that I believe that Martin is an economic Marxist. He didn't accept Marxism and communism wholeheartedly for a number of reasons. But he's an economic Marxist, and he understood the power structure and how the economy and economic factors dictated who survived and who did not survive. So even as early, now the later King is much more radical, but as early as Montgomery, he understood the bus boycott. Not only would it stop blacks from getting on the bus, but it would hurt the bus companies' pocket. And oftentimes it's missed that literally every city he went into, he called for an economic boycott. What made Birmingham successful, one of the things that made Birmingham successful, was not only the children marching and to see this gross and pornographic treatment of children by police officers with dogs and water hoses, but they had the Easter Sunday boycott. And you know that when black folk don't buy clothes for Easter, come and talk back to me. I mean, I grew up in church. When we got the Easter outfits. And when they didn't buy clothes for that Easter Sunday, it put pressure on those merchants. And the merchants said, we've got to do something about this. And they began hiring more blacks. And so there's no doubt that the economic structure, economic oppression is significant. If you go back to Jared mentioning Two Americas, also the other America, he gave that speech multiple times after the Watts riots in '65. But he made it clear that there are two Americas: one where people live in luxury, and the other where people live on the lonely island of poverty. And Coretta Scott King, she calls it the pornography or the evil or the violence, that's the word she uses, the violence of poverty and all the things that poverty creates. And I'll say this, and I know I got to stop, but Doc says that after fighting the civil rights movement and getting voting rights and the right to ride on the bus and breaking interstate, having integration on interstate travel, he says it's a crime for a man to be able to go to a counter to get a hamburger, but don't have the money to buy a hamburger. And so civil rights didn't cost America anything, but economic rights, economic justice is where it was going to hurt. And so he transitioned and he began moving towards the Poor People Campaign, which would have been the culmination of his work. But unfortunately, he was assassinated before then, and we never saw the fulfillment in totality of what Dr. King could have brought to America with the Poor People's Campaign.
Thank you for that. Just in a few moments, we'll be back. We want to continue this conversation, talking about Martin Luther King's legacy, and we'll go a little bit deeper into that.
We don't sit and wait till somebody wait their turn. We cut you off and we talk over. That's what the barbershop is about.
Winner will be, but the illusion, or what you were alluding to, is the fact that you look like a criminal.
He don't even vote, so his vote don't even count.
If you really want to do something, get black people together, and we're going to start having an agenda. We're going to write down 10 things that we want for our people.
You know, in the climate that we're in right now, the hope is gone, and it's a lot of unrest, and just, man, how can people come back together and just unite?
WRCX TV 40, and we're continuing this conversation about Martin Luther King and his legacy. And so, Jared, I have a question for you, and I'd love for us to talk a little bit about Martin Luther King in a different way. So we talked about how we learned about Martin Luther King as a pacifist, a nonviolent activist, an intelligent individual with an intellect and things as such. Tell me a little bit more about why you believe that Martin Luther King was framed in that way.
It's a more convenient narrative. And so Martin Luther King Day, it's Martin Luther King Day, and we're going to see a lot of pacifying of black voices. People are going to say, what would Martin Luther King think of that, right? They're going to say he would never approve of this kind of rhetoric or this kind of violence, et cetera, right? And one thing people misunderstand about Martin Luther King is he just didn't think that violence and destruction of property was a good strategy. Not that it was morally abhorrent, right? He understood that people were angry and the riot was the voice of the voiceless. He understood that. And so he would have never tried to pacify people in a way that people use his legacy to pacify us, right? And what people need to understand is Martin Luther King was a lot more radical, as Dr. White alluded to earlier, than we give him credit for, and his analysis went a lot deeper than that. They frame him as if he was only worried about respectability politics, right? Put on a suit, look well, talk right, talk proper, don't do anything to shake up too many feathers, right? The people around him were saying, yo, look well, talk proper, don't shake too many feathers, but as Dr. White said, he was steadfast in his message and what he believed in. And I think it's unfair to his legacy what they try to do with regard to pacifying activists and the Black Lives Matter movement, using some of his cherry-picked words that he used to kind of shut us up.
Absolutely. I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think what you're speaking to is just the inability for leaders, specifically black leaders, if we look at the historical context, being more complex than this individual principle that will be palatable or will be able to be marketable, mass-produced, and things as such. So Dr. White, talk to us a little bit about this specific message. Martin Luther King as a non-violent activist. Tell me a little bit about why was it important to frame him in that way? And then talk to me a little bit about a critical analysis of that. Has that been beneficial for us? Did we grow from that? Did we learn from that? Please tell me.
Okay, I think that framing him, the use of the nomenclature of framing Dr. King as a nonviolent activist is not necessarily a fair assessment, because that's who he was. He makes it clear that Gandhi furnished the method, but Jesus furnished the message. That King was wholeheartedly committed to nonviolence, not necessarily a pacifist, but he was committed to nonviolence as a tool to dismantle white supremacy. For a number of reasons, he was committed to nonviolence. Number one, because of his Christian worldview. He clearly understood the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus says, love your enemies. And he was convinced, after reading about Gandhi and reading about the Salt March of Gandhi and how Gandhi overthrew the British government, he was wholeheartedly committed to nonviolence as a way of fighting racism, Jim Crowism in America. He was committed to that. And I think that we do damage when we extrapolate King from the 1960s in the heart of the American Civil Rights Movement and put him in the 2000s or 2020s without understanding contextually what was going on. There was no way in the world that we could have sustained a violent guerrilla warfare fight against white supremacy. We didn't have enough guns. We didn't have enough. There were not enough people committed to dying for the cause of civil rights. And so King, when the riots of '65 happened, Stokely Carmichael gets on the platform in Greenwood, Mississippi, argues Black Power, the Black Power movement starts. King has a fit. He says, y'all about to mess this up because we cannot do that. But then finally, King understood that violence besmirches or mars the character of the perpetrator of the violence, as well as the person who what violence was perpetrated against. King believes in this ideology of personalism. And personalism argues that every human being is made in the image of God. And when I perpetrate violence against Jared or against you, I am marring the very image of God in you. And so you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, even if you don't treat me with dignity and respect. Simply because you're created in the image of God. I got one last point, I'm stopping. And he argues, okay, once we get over Jim Crowism and racism, our desire is to build a beloved community. It's not to build a black nation that oppresses white people. So if I make you my enemy and I overpower you with violence, now once I get in power, I have to use that same power that you used on me to keep you oppressed. But if I love the hell out of you and make you a friend and use love as the weapon, now we can walk together and build community. And so I think that King was, again, wholeheartedly committed to nonviolence because of his Christian ethic and because he was clear that that's the only way to build beloved community.
Got it. So there are two things that immediately come to my mind, and I want to go to you, Jared, just to reiterate. So one of the things that you said that I think is really important is that Martin Luther King chose nonviolence because he believed that violence would impact the individual who participated in it, even if it was for the sake, for a grander cause, right? So it was the psychological impact, even to take it out of the religious context, is the psychological impact of participating in violence that Martin Luther King was worried about happening on a mass scale. What would we be if we were to go into a civil rights war or a civil war, right? And at the end of that war, if we win, what would we be psychologically? The second thing that came to my mind that you said, and I want to make sure that our viewers can understand, is that Martin Luther King also understood the capacity of Black folks at that point in time as it pertains to his nonviolent protests, and the capacity is important to note when moving forward in a movement. So, Jared, after hearing Dr. White's thoughts around this capacity and around this importance for Martin Luther King as a nonviolent activist, kind of speak to how that impacts him being defined as radical when his ultimate goal may have been to coexist with the white Americans rather than to find that independence within America for Black folks.
Dr. King's ultimate goal was to get each other to see our humanity. Right? Again, going back to that notion of agape love. Right? I love you unconditionally, without regard to your economic status, without regard to your color of your skin, without regard to your zip code or where you live or how many children you have. I love you unconditionally. And that's something very hard for us to achieve. And that kind of love is radical within itself, right? Like how I put my love for you above my economic interest. How radical is that? How many of us can achieve that, right? And he lived his life like that. Dr. King was, a good stock, right? He was solidly middle class. He could have went on and been a televangelist. Made millions of dollars, right? But he said, no, I love people. I love humanity. And I want to do whatever I can to improve humanity, right? And I think that's the message, right? I'm sure he had love for Stokely Carmichael and Bobby Seale and everyone else, right? And he was mad because he understood, as Dr. White said, the consequences of that rhetoric. But at the end of the day, he loved them as he loved everybody he was fighting for. So I think to pacify anyone using Dr. King's legacy, again, it's a gross misuse of his legacy.
I really appreciate what you said because you mentioned like him being like radical in his principle around love, right? And most of the times when we talk about civil rights movements, when we look at the continuum of radicalism, it's kind of like who's willing to die and who's not willing to die, right? And Martin Luther King's take may have been more from a principle saying to say like who's willing to love versus who's willing not to, right? And I am not to choose which one of them works, but it is important to know that those different continuums lie out there. So thank you so much for that. What were you going to say?
May I say this?
Please.
And I don't want to take up too much time.
No,
as Dr. White was talking, I thought about the events of January 6th and this violent insurrection that we just witnessed where people were storming the Capitol, police officers were killed, and protesters were killed. I was at the March of Washington this summer, in August, and that was not even a thought in our mind. It wasn't there to be violent. It wasn't this kind of radical takeover we wanted to achieve, right? Because now the movement isn't about supremacy. We don't want, when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not saying Black Lives Matter more, right? We're just saying that our lives matter as much as yours. And the only reason we're here is to convey that message to you, right? That violent insurrection was about, we want to keep our supremacy. We want to stay in power. Martin Luther King wasn't interested in that, right? So the march on Washington in August didn't get violent because there wasn't a violent spirit that motivated us, right? It was a spirit of humanity. I just wanted to reassert a obvious notion. My life matters, right? what they wanted to assert is this is our country and we don't like the way it's going.
Yeah.
And that difference in ideology, that difference in philosophy and spirit is caused the difference that we see in the behavior of the protesters.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And I want to end with you, and if you could tell me as specific as possible. With that being said, looking at how that motive, difference in the groups for motive, tell me a little bit about when folks that are more on the nonviolent Martin Luther King side, tell me a little bit about that motive to want change legislatively and to want to see change systemically still being something worthwhile, how that sets them apart from individuals whose motive is to keep status quo going where it is now.
Okay. King makes it clear, Frederick Douglass makes it clear, the same quote that King uses, that power concedes nothing without demand. And King's nonviolent protest methodology of nonviolent protest was a way to shift the power structure, bring the fight directly to their feet, make them, if they got to beat you, make them embarrass themselves unto the point that they recognize your humanity. And so this whole issue of power was very significant in King in thought because he understood that those that had power, they were going to do everything to keep it. And we see that even now. Again, that's what happened on the 6th. It was all about keeping power. And so King was called, he called for a radical redistribution in his ideology of the beloved community, a radical redistribution of economics, of property and of wealth. And so for those who are Christian, we talk about the radicality even of Jesus. When Jesus in Luke chapter 4:18 says that he's come preaching the acceptable year, that was the year of Jubilee. And in the year of Jubilee, 3 things happened. And we're talking about Jesus being radical. Slaves were released, property that was taken was given back, and all debts were canceled.
That's good. So like power.
Yeah.
Power.
Yeah.
We've got to chew on that. We'll be back with more.
So I say to you, I've been here for a long time. I've dedicated my whole life to this community, mentoring young people, mentoring people that got a little gray hair, sometimes mentoring people with a lot of gray hair. But the issue that is near and dear to my heart is that I have the passion, I have the time, I have the energy, and I am proud to announce the fact that I'm accepting the challenge to be your next mayor for the city of Dayton.
I seen Jeff work from being a school board member to being commissioner and now running for mayor. He doesn't just talk the talk, but he actually walks the walk, and I've seen that in every level.
These last 7 years on commission, I've had the privilege of serving with Jeff in these crazy times here, not only in Dayton but in the country and the world. You want someone like Jeff in charge. He's the kind of friend that always has your back, the kind of friend that tells you the truth. He's warm, he's a team builder, and he's exactly the kind of mayor I think that we need.
We have the wind, like I said, at our back in terms of doing some of the kind of things that we need to do to move Dayton in the right direction. I know that by being here in Dayton for the last, probably 6-7 decades, I've seen some great times and I've seen some challenging times. I don't think I've ever seen times that have been as challenging as what we had over the last 18 months to 2 years with the pandemic, shooting, tornadoes, and things of that nature. And I want to help move Dayton back to its level of greatness that we have had and experienced when Dayton was at one time called the Gem City.
To me, when I think about Jeff Mims' service, I think about the words from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that being the most persistent question, that being that, what are you doing for those others in need?
Everything he's done has always been to help the community. Even as a school teacher, he has helped the students. As a school board member, he helped his district. As city commissioner, he has helped the city. And I know as mayor, he will continue to do the good work that has been happening in our city.
He's prepared. He has worked at all levels of government practically. He knows so many people in the area. He's gotten out. He's reached out to people across the city asking, how are you? What do you need? As a commissioner, he's a very warm and friendly person. He's going to bring all that experience into being mayor, and he's going to do great things here in the city. So I really am proud to support him.
Welcome back. And we want to talk about a topic that is sweeping the nation right now: community and police relations. While we know there is a long historical context about community and police relations, what we've seen in the last 6 years is a nation rise with protests, really holding our law enforcement system accountable for the ways in which it has oppressed marginalized communities. In the recent months, Ohio legislation has passed the Stand Your Ground Act. This is an act that we know largely has impacted folks of color. And honestly, I just want to have a very open and transparent conversation around the way in which it will impact us moving forward. Jared, I understand that you have a background in law enforcement, specifically as it pertains to getting your Juris Doctorate. Tell me a little bit about this legislation, maybe the history of it and how it impacts us today.
So you mentioned community police relations, right? And the one thing we have to understand about America is America has always gave white men the power to police black people in any way they see fit, right? And over time we've evolved, but as we've seen, even going into the 21st century, a lot of the Jim Crow South states held on to this old law called Stand Your Ground. Stand Your Ground means if I get into a fight with you, Dr. White, and if Stand Your Ground is not the law, I have a duty to retreat if it's safe to do so. I have a duty to run or hide in third perk just to get away from the harm that this fight has caused. Stand Your Ground says, no, I don't have to do that, right? If you feel like you are put in danger, then you got the right to defend yourself however you see fit. And maybe on its face, there's nothing wrong with that. But if we think about the history of America and we think about some of the race relations and the inequities in the criminal justice system, the impact that it's going to have is very disparate, right? So the most famous case is the Trayvon Martin case, when George Zimmerman took Trayvon Martin's life, right? All George Zimmerman had to do was say, I felt like I was in danger. And then George Zimmerman's lawyer did a job. He did a great job of painting Trayvon Martin as this dangerous, scary black guy that, of course, he was in fear of his life, right? And because he was in fear of his life, he had every right to do what he did that resulted in the murder of Trayvon Martin. So unfortunately, what we're seeing is Ohio becoming more and more conservative and looking, unfortunately, more and more like those Jim Crow South states. So recently, as you said, we passed the Stand Your Ground law, and if people interpret that as a racist dog whistle, I wouldn't disagree, right? We went red in the last election, and I think we're trying to assert ourselves as the predominantly white conservative stronghold, and I think with the passing of that law has implications on not only race relations, but in a more indirect way of community police relations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for telling me that. And I think that the reason why that's so important is because as we talk about Martin Luther King and him being framed as a nonviolent activist, it sounds almost as if, legally what happened is that this individual was countered to that framework of as a nonviolent person. So, Dr. White, tell me a little bit about Black America's history in America, seen as somebody like counter to nonviolence. How did that image of being violent become one that would be so palpable to America?
I'm going to use one of my big words, epistemology, the study of knowledge. When those who are in power dictate and control what knowledge is, they always paint the narrative in their favor. The hunter is always the victor because he has the gun and not the lion or the rabbit. And so in order to justify the dehumanization of blacks as far back as 1619, when first ancestors came to Jamestown or wherever in that area they did land, black people had to be dehumanized. They had to be seen as animalistic. They had to be seen as something other than human. And so Martin Buber, a German philosopher, talks about I, thou versus I, it. So if I can treat you as an it, if I can, what Cornel West says, thingify you, I can treat you in any kind of way. If I can see you as a thing, I can brand you, I can castrate you, I can mate you and other black women. As a man, I can treat you like I treat one of my animals. And so the narrative is important to create this picture and paint this picture of blacks, in particular black men, as super predators. You know, and there are those who think that the black community just loved the Clintons. No, she was wrong. She was dead wrong to use that terminology, super predators. These are human beings. These are our brothers. These are our cousins, our fathers. And so the narrative becomes important. And so Ice Cube says, my skin is my sin. That I do nothing else wrong besides be black, exist as a black person, oftentimes in spaces that white people think are reserved for only white people. So when I go into Saks, when I go into Gucci, when I go to Nordstrom's, they look at me funny, even though I got $10,000 in my pocket, even though I'm in a Rolex. You know, if I'm living in a white neighborhood or renting a Airbnb in a white neighborhood, a predominantly white neighborhood, they call the police on me because my black skin don't belong in their domicile, in their space. And so we recognize that this painting the picture of blacks being violent and being animals is so important. We see it in film, we see it in movies, and King says that America is the most violent country that existed. And so even when we go back to Rodney King, watch the video. Rodney King is on the ground, handcuffed, and they're still beating him. Why? Not because he was dangerous, not because he could do anything to him, but because his skin was seen as a danger.
And I think why that's so important to understand is because people may understand that in theory, but people don't always understand that tangibly, right? So that film that was created like decades ago, Birth of a Nation, right? This film created the understanding for white Americans of who black Americans were, creating this image that, you know, these black men were these terrors, right? And that image that went into the psyche of individuals are literally the foundation to legislation against black Americans moving forward. And so when we look at legislation like Stand Your Ground, we can't objectively look at it as if it does not have an impact that is inequitable. We have to look at the historical context. So Jared, for me, tell me a little bit about how that historical context and that that psychological draining or framing black people as more violent impacts community and police relations today.
Well, one thing is people want to act as though the criminal justice system exists in a vacuum. Like the people that's on juries and the people who apply to be police officers aren't getting these same messages over and over and over again, right? And I worked with the police, as you alluded to, for years. And specifically with regard to Dayton, Ohio, when you police the West Side, it's almost like you have to go occupy that space, right? Like it's as if I'm a military soldier who is called to occupy the West Side, and you go in there looking for action, right? And because a lot of these officers come from places that isn't this community. They come from Eaton, Ohio. They come from Miamisburg, Centerville, Huber Heights, et cetera, et cetera. And their experience with black people is limited. And so what the messages they receive is the same ones we all receive. We know to throw those messages away, right? We can see each other's humanity. And I'm not saying that, you know, they're incapable of seeing our humanity. They just haven't yet. And because they haven't yet, what they police is something they don't know. And so what happens is we get this disparate treatment, right? We get this, what we see in the Black Lives Matter protest, the response to that protest as opposed to the response to that insurrection was a clear and stark illustration about how those narratives took hold, right? They could have never imagined that white men were the angry insurrectionist terrorists, right? It was always this angry black man, this ex-slave looking for revenge. And we better be well prepared for him because he's bestial, right? He's over-sexualized, he's raging, got these, he's slitting at the mouth, ready to get revenge and ready to exact violence against America. And when you think about Dr. King's legacy, what we understand is that's just simply not true. We're all human beings, right? That was Dr. King's power, was he was able to create a counter-narrative to that. And he created this stark contrast between seeing Bull Connor and his dogs attack these people who were peacefully protesting, asserting their First Amendment right. And what that did is show people, especially in the North, wow, you know, we know these to be human beings. Look at them, they're human beings, and in the South, they still treat them as if they're something else. They dignify them, they treat them as if they're not human, and this is wrong.
I really appreciate that. I'm finding some synergy in your responses. Both of you all mentioned something that I think is important. You talked about this notion of respectability politics. Earlier, you kind of made notion that you could be in a store with thousands of dollars in your pocket and still be treated a certain way. You can, rent spaces, Airbnbs in certain neighborhoods and get the police called on you because you are impacting or messing up the image of this space that seemed to be sacred. And you mentioned respectability politics also. But Dr. White, so tell me a little bit about that respectability politics as an armor to say against the world. Is that successful? This idea that if we present ourselves in a specific way, that will impact the way in which we interact with America or with that image that was created.
I wholeheartedly disagree, vehemently disagree that respectability politics work. We've tried that. We've tried to dance to their music. We tried to wear our hair the way their hair, they say we should wear our hair. We tried to dress the way they said we should dress. Over Auschwitz and a number of other Jewish encampments during the Holocaust, there was a German phrase, and I can't remember the phrase, but translated to English, it says, freedom, work brings about freedom. And they literally were telling the Jewish people that if you work harder, you will eventually get free. How long have we heard that? And so now people are saying black people are lazy. Hell, we built this country. When white folk were sitting down chilling, our ancestors out there picking cotton and building, and literally every major college and institution in America was built by slaves, from the White House to the outhouse. We built all of that stuff. And so respectability politics never works. And so when we look at interpreting laws, we look at interpreting actions of America, I think that critical race theory, Derek Bell, critical race theory always comes into play. That racism is intertwined into every aspect of America, every facet. It's not aberrant, it's not abnormal, it's not a one-off. That's the way America does business.
I appreciate you saying that, and it makes me think that if we know that there are historical contexts in these images and that impacts us today, we must consider that when we are choosing the legislation in which we will navigate our world. So thank you all so much for giving me those responses. We'll be back.
People have walked here, you know what I'm saying, carrying 5 or 6 bags leaving. We had to be in the hood to be effective.
As a whole, we're feeding the people that need to be fed. I need 6 people. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 people grabbing 5 bags.
That we're helping out are the forgotten people in the community, and they definitely need it. So we just want to be a part of the people that spread joy for the holiday. Sometimes you don't even have to be poor or impoverished to be here and take the blessings.
It takes a village, it seems like, so I definitely want to make sure I'm doing my part. One of the things I give Montgomery County credit for this year is even through the pandemic, they've been able to feed our community. And this is just another part of it. For the last, 8 or 9 months, you've had young people, and it's awesome when you have millennials taking a stand, standing in the gap to make sure that a community is fed. And that's what they're doing here today in Young Black Professionals. They're standing in the gap to make a difference and help somebody else other than themselves.
We don't sit and wait till somebody wait their turn. We cut you off and we talk over. That's what the barbershop is about.
Winner will be, but the illusion, or what you were alluding to, is the fact that you look like a criminal.
Well, see, he don't even vote, so his vote don't even count.
If you really want to do something, get black people together, and we're going to start having an agenda. We're going to write down 10 things that we want for our people.
In the climate that we're in right now, the hope is gone, and it's a lot of unrest and just, man, how can people come back together and just unite?
Welcome back. We have had such a in-depth conversation, contextualizing who Martin Luther King is, and then having a little bit more critical analysis about the way in which he was framed and what did we miss about Martin Luther King. That last segment, we got to talk about community and police relations, and I mean, we could talk forever about that. But I want to end this program to have this last segment really be rooted in a conversation around passing the torch. So 60 years later, after the Civil Rights Movement, where we've learned leader to leader, influence to influence, figured out ways in which legislation has impacted us, my first question, and I'm going to go to you, Jared, tell me, 60 years later, what should we have learned from the Civil Rights Movement that impacts the way in which we organize and advocate for our communities today?
Yes, sir. I think the advantage that I have as a millennial is the access to information, right? The Eyes on Your Prize was a great documentary, and I think it shaped the way we think about the civil rights movement, and as it should, right? Because it did go in depth about the movement. However, as we spoke to earlier, I can go further into the legacy of Dr. King and who he was and what he preached about, right? So now I know that I'm not just marching for you to see my humanity. Yes, I'm screaming Black Lives Matter because that's the minimum. I need you to see my humanity. However, I need you to change these laws and policies and govern in which a way that you see my humanity, right? It's not enough for me to sit at a lunch counter. We got there, right? And that's, let them tell it, that's all Martin Luther King talked about, right? He just wanted to eat a hamburger next to a white person, and that's the furthest from the truth, right? He wanted you to have money to buy that hamburger, right? He wanted you to have money to pay the bills. He didn't want us to live in the slums. He didn't want us to fear police violence or state violence. He didn't want us to fear over high rents or any of that stuff, right? He wanted every human being to have a certain level of existence, right? And if I love you, I'm gonna provide that level of existence for you. So when we march, I think we march in the true spirit of Dr. King. We learn how to organize from watching Selma, and we learn how to organize from watching Eyes on the Prize and these other narratives that are more common around Dr. King. And I think we use that as fuel to guide our steps. And I'm very thankful for that movement and the work that our ancestors put in. However, we're no fools. We're no dumps. I'm not saying that the generations previous to us were. I'm just saying we're armed with a lot of information, and I think a lot of us know exactly what we want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. You pull out something that I think is important, and as I transition to you, Dr. White, he framed his conversation as a millennial. I want to hear from you as an individual who we would consider more wise. Tell us, what should we as millennials know about your time, what you contributed, and then as you consider passing the torch, like what should we know? What are you passing to us for us to move forward?
Okay. Brother Cox made it clear I was the older guy in the conversation. So thank you for allowing this old guy. I don't even know what to say about that for being a part of the conversation. But no, I think that my generation is on the tail end of those who had gotten comfortable. The Bible says they were at ease in Zion. My parents were, college graduates, upper middle class. We enjoyed all of that stuff, and we got easy. And I think that our generation, my generation, is on the tail end of that. And my advice or my encouragement to the next generation is let's not lose what we had. Yeah. Let those gains that we made that were made during the civil rights movement, they've been eroding away. They have been constantly pulling those away, and because some of us in my generation have been able to go on to higher education, to live in the suburbs, to drive luxury cars, we've lost track of the fact that we have brothers and sisters that are still in the hood, that's still struggling to make it, that still suffer under the oppressive structures and systems of racism in America. And we have access to the boardroom, we have access to being in banking and financing and all this stuff, but we forget we've got others who have not made it there yet, and we have a responsibility of holding the door open, kick the door down and hold it open for somebody to come in behind us and not have this attitude that we've made it, and so we move from racism to classism. From racism to classism. So I think that would be my main concern and my main advice to those who are coming behind. Let's make sure that we continue to move together as a people. And King made it clear that, if I don't make it, if you don't make it, I don't make it. I can never be my best until Jared is his best. And Jared can never be his best until I'm my best. And so he talks about economics in particular. And one of my professors painted the picture that if my brother, my neighbor is poor and I'm rich and I'm not doing anything to assist them from coming out of poverty, I can't rest that night because they're going to kick my door down at some point in time. But if I'm assisting them and doing the best I can with that agape love to raise their level, standard of living, and making legislation and charity and providing opportunities, then we both can rest that night.
Absolutely. So the two things, if I want to make sure, because I want to make sure that there's takeaways. You said to make sure that the small gains that was gathered do not varnish, do not go away, that we still remember those gains. And then secondly, for us to be aware of the way in which classism, even inside of the black community, can lead to our demise. So it makes me think, Jared, tell me, as a millennial, I imagine you all are one of the most educated generations, one of the generations with the highest earning potential coming up so far. And we see that across the board. Of course, the equity numbers will show that people of color have less access. But tell me, how do millennials go about building and organizing now, keeping that classism framework that Dr. White provided? How do we make sure to organize and to move forward and to build our own legacies while not forgetting how classism will impact the rest of us, our family who has not made it?
Simply put, it's all of us or none of us. I'll say that again. It's all of us or none of us, right? We like to separate ourselves in these classes and in these neighborhoods, and we want to move to the suburbs, et cetera, to distinguish ourselves from those Negroes who doesn't have the intellect or the articulation or et cetera, that I have, right? But what you fail to realize, as long as you're happy with those gains, then we can keep the system in place as long as we want to, right? Because you're not going to do anything to help them. And as long as you're okay with this car that I'm willing to give you, with this house I'm willing to let you buy, you'll never aspire to be owner of the means of production, which is the people who make the real money, right? Not to be overcritical of any of my brothers, right? But we have an obsession with the t-shirts, right? And we can print our logo on a t-shirt. But they'll never let us own gilding, right? Which is the manufacturer of the cloth that we put our logo on, right? Gilding is the owner of the means of production, right? So when we separate ourselves in these classes, what we have to realize is that we're not even in the same stratosphere as the rich and powerful.
Be careful, you're going to be labeled as a Marxist. You hit it down that route, right? Okay?
No.
You hit it down that route.
So this is so good, though. This is a great conversation that you're bringing up. So it makes me think of this, right? So if we're talking about classism, we have to be very transparent. So me and you are both members of historically black led organizations, right? A lot of us have had interactions with traditional black organizations such as National Urban League, NAACP, things that such. So my question to you, Dr. White, is tell me, what do these traditional black organizations that have had over a century or close to a century's worth of traditional programming, what do they do to modernize so that they can become even more relevant in 2021?
I think that you have to look at original intent. And if they're still going to continue to follow what their original intent was, or are they going to modify themselves to meet what's going on today? And let's be clear, the NAACP is legal. I mean, so during the Civil Rights Movement, they played their part. They did not get in the street and march. They went to court. I mean, Thurgood Marshall, on and on down the line. You know, they were in the courts. SCLC was in the street. Urban League, when people moved to the north, they facilitated the transition from being an agrarian peoples to being a people that were in an industrialized society, and equipped them and trained them to do that. And so I think we have to look at what their intent is and be clear about that, and not expect people to do something that's outside of their purview of responsibility.
And so let me add some pushback. Just my thoughts are, being connected to these organizations, I've learned a lot, and a lot of the things that you've offered. So there are a lot of things that they've done well, and then there's a lot of things that traditionally these black organizations, if we look back and provide the same critical analysis that we see we have some opportunities of growth, right? And so with those opportunities of growth, like looking at those versus like, you know, traditionally their intent was very clear, and even as a member of Alpha Phi Fraternity Incorporated, I can say our oldest founder in the 20s went to our convention and said, hey, I am unsure if we are still on the path to what we started initially, right? So we have a very early reference of somebody being a leaven of self-examination, right? So with that leaven of self-examination, how do these traditional organizations move forward in a way that goes, we give you credit for what you have done in the past, but this is what we need from you today.
Again, I think it's self-analysis. I think that bringing younger voices to the table that can clearly articulate what the needs of current society is. You know, I give you a few seconds to tell the story. I was traveling and I was in St. Louis. I mean, St. Louis one day, in New Orleans the next day, and I was staying at the Marriott. And when I got to the Marriott in New Orleans, they gave me my key, and I got upstairs, and I kept trying to use the key. The key wouldn't work. I went back downstairs. I complained. I'm a Marriott Rewards member. Y'all treat me like this, yada yada yada. And the lady said, well, here's the key. And I went upstairs, and when I opened the door, I reached in my pocket and realized I had two keys. I had a key from the Marriott in St. Louis, and I was trying to use that key from the Marriott in St. Louis to open the door to the Marriott in New Orleans. Old keys don't work in new doors.
Yes, sir.
And I think that is what is most significant. I think that's the takeaway, is that there are current issues, and if leadership is disconnected from the contemporary issues or the zeitgeist of the moment, then they will continue to try to use old solutions to new problems.
Thank you so much for that. Jared, my last question goes to you. And I want you to ponder over this. As a young millennial, as somebody who believes in the principles of MLK and understands him to be a more complex person, as a young leader of today, tell me, if you were passed the torch, what would you do with that? What would you contribute, you know, to today's time, to today's need, to our local community? What would you contribute if you were passed the torch?
Yes, sir. That's an excellent question, and I feel honored to have the opportunity, to have the knowledge. I'm glad that God put it on my heart to fight on behalf of every Daytonian, for every young black boy and girl, for every citizen of this world, right? I'm glad that God allowed me to see the humanity in others. And because I see that, my job is to express this agape love. I have a particular skill set, which is the analysis of legislation and law, et cetera, and I have to use that to elevate the lives of my brothers and sisters, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their race, regardless of their national origin, their sex, their sexual orientation, any of that, right? My only job is to love you, and I'm gonna love you the best I know how. So if that's in legislation, that's drafting legislation, I'm gonna do that, right? If that's in political office, I'm gonna do that. If that's on a pulpit, I'm gonna do that. But I'm gonna love you as much as I can, to the best of my abilities. That was the legacy of Dr. King, and I gladly will accept that.
Dr. Martin Luther King was a leader of the Civil Rights Movement. His time not only impacted when he was alive and here with us to offer, but here we are 6 decades later, still carrying on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. I thank you so much for coming and having this conversation, and we look forward to having this conversation even more in the future. Thank you so much for following us here today on WRCX TV 40. We'd also like to thank our amazing sponsor, Third Perk Coffee House in Dayton, Ohio. We look forward to talking with you later.